Okay, let's begin with prayer. Dear God, thank you for Rick Rice. Thank you for the many years he served the university and the church and the world. Thank you for the openness of God movement that he started and now is making its influence everywhere. Help us to learn from him this morning, I pray in Christ's name. Amen.
Amen.
Yeah.
Over to you, Rick.
Well, good morning, everyone. And thank you for the opportunity to be together with you and to talk about a book of mine that just came out about 10 days ago, actually, the middle of last week, and coincided with all sorts of interesting things in our lives at the university and the country and the world. I think we should mention, before we get too much farther, happy birthday to Bonnie Dwyer, who has contributed a great deal to many of us, including me. Bonnie and I go all the way back to Worthington, Ohio, a long time ago, when we lived on opposite sides of the street. Well, maybe not, but anyway, close. So I've appreciated her many contributions. And thank you, Dave, for that nice introduction and the prayer. I hope it's answered as we talk today. So let's proceed. I'm going to take a running start at our topic and move on that way. This is, we're going to be thinking about God today. And it's interesting to see how important theologians and influential theologians have talked about the doctrine of God. For Paul Tillich, why should we think about God? Well, as Tillich describes it, the doctrine of God is the beginning and end of all theological thought. God is the subject of theology. And according to Ogden, the problem of God is not one problem among several others. It is the only problem there is. So, coming to a clear, attractive, faithful to the Bible, logical, meaningful understanding of God is the main task that thinkers face. And here we have from Jesus' own words, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, and all your mind." This is the greatest and first commandment. So here we are, faced with the challenge. Our greatest responsibility as human beings is to love God and to do it with heart, soul, and mind. I was always impressed with a statement from Ellen White, if we can start with one of those. She says, "The truths of the divine word can best be appreciated by an intellectual Christian." Now, those are not two words that are put together that often, intellectual Christian. But to be an intellectual Christian is to perhaps move in the direction of emphasizing the importance of the greatest and first commandment, loving God, not only with the heart and soul, but with all the mind. And so in a sense, that's sort of the background of what we're looking at today. Now,
Richard, you need to unmute yourself because I think they muted everyone because you were getting talked over.
all right. So can you hear me now?
You're back.
I'm back. Now, did I mute myself or was that you, Dave?
I muted everybody, but I didn't realize that everybody meant you too. So now I've unmuted everybody.
Now I'm back. Okay.
We're giving Dave too much control.
All right. Okay. Are we recording this, Dave?
Yes.
Okay. So you can edit as you go along. I did give you a copy of my slides for fear you would anticipate where I was going and mute me along the way. No, I'm just... Anyway, how do we go about worshiping God with the mind, thinking about God? Well, this is very interesting. Richard Rorty, influential philosopher, in a book, Philosophy in the Mirror of Nature, makes this rather significant statement, I believe. How do we actually think about God? Well, he's talking about philosophy, but he says it's pictures rather than propositions, metaphors rather than statements, which determine most of our philosophical convictions. I think Rorty is also describing our basic theological convictions. We think about God with pictures and metaphors rather than propositions and statements. Concepts are important, we must pay attention to them, but behind the concepts, the deeper than that are the convictions that arise from or that are connected with the basic picture that we have of God. And so that brings us to look at what fundamental pictures should be viewed as. I know most of you are far more scientifically literate than I am, but one of the most important contributions to the history of science was Thomas Kuhn's book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. And Kuhn came to an interesting conclusion conclusion as he was working on this. How does scientific progress get made? And he talks about what he calls normal science. And that is the science that operates with a steady accumulation of evidence within a given framework that illuminates our understanding of the world. But along the way, there are anomalies. That is to say, there's an inevitable accumulation of things that don't quite fit. And finally, these anomalies become heavy enough that people realize there may be something that needs to change about the basic perspective within which we're operating. But to make that change involves more than just a minor adjustment. It involves a whole different way of looking at things. A revolution then is a change in fundamental perspectives or paradigms, a word that's almost always associated with what he talks about. And so here we are. I've tried to come up here with a couple of diagrams, one referring to, I hope, one referring to the Ptolemaic system in which the world is the center of the universe. And everything that revolves around the world. And so the sun, the moon, the stars, we're the middle of things here on Earth. And as we know, there had to be some interesting developments there to explain why the planets that revolve around us seem to back up every once in a while. And so they had circles and then cycles within the circles to explain why, say, Mercury and Venus seem to be going around us, but then they back up and make another circle. Well, anyway, the Copernican revolution was a complete recasting of our understanding of what we now call the solar system, not the Earth system. And that was, if we put the sun at the center of things, well, then we have and the Earth becomes now a satellite of the sun instead of the middle of everything. We've got now a new picture, a new paradigm in which to put our astronomical data. Well, that's what a paradigm does. Now, I think that plays an important role in understanding the position that we're looking at today. It arises from the view that the traditional view of God, or the traditional picture of God, which has a great deal of going for it, it accounts for a great deal, it's attractive in many ways, is not the only way to look at God. Alongside the absolute monarch, God is also presented as a loving parent. So what if we take as our fundamental picture of God, or our basic paradigm, not the idea of an absolute monarch, but the idea of a loving parent, that picture of God. So we have contrasting paradigms for God's relation to the world. According to the traditional paradigm, the world is God's product. God is creator. God lays out the way the world is to operate, and it fulfills God's purposes to the last detail. Another way of looking at this is to see the world as God's invention. A world is like a well-crafted machine. It does exactly what God wants it to do in every respect. And of course, that's appealing because there are things in our lives that we want to do exactly, operate exactly the way they're supposed to. I don't want a lot of surprises when I'm driving my car to work. I don't want it to break down. I don't want to have to guess how the steering wheel is going to affect the car. I don't want to hope that the machine still operates, the engine still runs, and so on. I want to get there in a very predictable, reliable way. We want reality to be reliable. But there's some things about that somehow leave us wishing for something more. The open paradigm, the view of God that open theism embraces, is the idea that instead of the world being God's product, it is God's project. God invests a great deal in it. God has designed it extensively, but God is active in the world, pursuing God's goals in a progressive way and interacting with it. So the world doesn't automatically become everything God wants it to be. It is a work in progress, shall we say. And so instead of the world being God's invention, which is under God's total detailed control, the world is God's adventure. So the world can do things that bring God new perspectives and enrich God's experience along the way. So I hope you see that these contrasting metaphors arise from different pictures of God, and they lead to different perspectives of the divine reality. For example, the prominent attributes of God, according to the traditional paradigm, the world is God's product or God's invention, is divine perfection. God could not be any better than he is. God could not change in any way. God is immutable. If perfection means that God is as good as it could possibly be, well, then if God changed at all, God would only become less perfect, and that's inconceivable. So perfection implies immutability. And then we have the three omnis. God is omnipotent, in total control. God is omniscient. God knows absolutely everything. God is everywhere, the power that upholds everything. And God is eternal. As generally understood, God is completely timeless. God lives in one moment in which God grasps all of reality, past, present, and future. It's the way God wants it to be. So those are the predominant or the prominent attributes of God in the traditional paradigm, which emphasizes God's sovereignty, control, and design. The open paradigm, shall we say, involves a more ongoing, dramatic view of God. And here the prominent attributes become love, interaction with the world God has made, responsiveness to events as they take place, resourceful in meeting a variety of situations and circumstances. Still, God is completely reliable. There are things about God that don't change. God is, throughout his dealings with all creation, the same being, pursuing the same objectives with the same commitment, but it does involve the idea that God takes risks, that God created a world in which things might not go precisely the way God wanted them to. So there is an element of uncertainty, there's an element of risk. The future is not entirely determined, the future is open to go in different directions. And those directions may be in ways that please God very much, or they may be in ways that leave God very disappointed. Now, each paradigm claims to meet the basic criteria of theological adequacy: a biblical basis, logical appeal, it makes sense, and third, practical inspiration. It guides the life, inspires the heart, as well as challenging the mind. Each paradigm claims to be able to do that. So there we are. At the same time, each paradigm raises some perplexing questions. Questions for the traditional view: what role is there for creaturely freedom? Are we simply fulfilling in every detail of our lives exactly the pattern that was pre-established? Or do we have a degree of personal initiative and personal choice? What about divine sensitivity? Is God's relation to the world all included within one single timeless experience? Or does God interact with events in the world as they take place? Do they have an effect on God as they actually happen? Or does God already in one timeless experience have all the value that might ever be contained in the world? Then, of course, there are questions for the open view. Is this a view of divine perfection that somehow represents the preeminent emphasis on God as the source and standard of all goodness and all perfection? What do we do with the familiar emphases on God's knowledge of the future, foreknowledge, God's providential activity in the world? What about the idea of divine predestination? Is it not the case that God has planned everything that takes place? And then prophecy. Some of the Adventists are a people of prophecy. We place a great deal of emphasis on the biblical forecast of what is to come, particularly the events that will bring history to an end. Well, what happens if you take the view that the future is open, that God to some extent learns about things as they take place? What content does prophecy have? What meaning does prophecy have if there's a certain indefiniteness and openness when it comes to the future? So there's no position without a price, shall we say. Major questions that have to be answered. Now, with all of that background, let's dive into the focus of our time together, and that is some of the issues that are discussed in the future of open theism, from antecedents to opportunities. What is the open view of God? According to the openness of God, I'll just give a preliminary sketch and we can leave things open, no pun intended, to interact before too long. According to the openness of God, God's essential nature is love. And out of love, God chose to bring into existence a world containing creatures who had the capacity to love him in return. Now, as a personal being, God seeks a personal relationship with these creatures. And so God is intensely interested in them, genuinely affected by their actions and decisions. So God is open to the world, and the world is open to God. Both creator and creatures contribute to the ongoing course of events, and God experiences these events as they happen. Now, in giving those who bear God's image the freedom to return his love, God ran the risk that they might pursue their own goals rather than God's and depart from God's hopes, wishes, and plans for them. But despite the pain that their rebellion brought to God, God's commitment to their welfare remains unconditional, and God continues to pursue God's ultimate goals for creation, particularly those created in God's image, in spite of and in response to the challenges and the complexities that their lack of cooperation has created for God. So that is sort of an overview. Now let's do a little history, okay? What are the precedents of the open view of God? Well, there were biblical scholars in the 19th century on the left there, and then in the 20th century, the one above and the one to the right, there were figures who anticipated the ideas of God. The one on the left is a picture of Adam Clarke. I don't know if that name means anything to you, but Adam Clarke was a very influential Baptist theologian, as I recall, who wrote a commentary, a 6-volume commentary on the entire Bible. I inherited my grandfather's edition of this commentary. It was kind of a standard before an Adventist commentary came out. And he said some things about God's relation to the world, that God's knowledge of contingent reality must itself be contingent and so on, although never followed that entirely to its conclusion. Then there was another writer, Lorenzo McCabe, who coined a word that I don't think has been used, at least I've never read it beyond his own writings, and that is the word nescience, N-E-S-C-I-E-N-C-E. What would nescience be? Well, we know what omniscience is. We know what ignorance is. Nescience would be not ignorance of something that's there to be known, but just not knowing something, particularly not knowing something that's not there to know. Okay, so that was his way of trying to describe what a relationship of an omniscient being might be to future events that aren't there to know. It's a matter of divine nescience. Now we've got others who've contributed to this discussion. Howard Ron Elseth, Did God Know? And then Gordon Olson, The Truth Shall Make You Free. Now, what's interesting about these figures, none of them, with the exception of Clarke, were trained theologians. They were diligent Bible students. I think we have to use that word. They spent a great deal of time and effort looking at different aspects of the Bible, and they came up with some remarkable statistics which argue basically that if you look at the Bible very carefully, you come up with hundreds of texts that seem to indicate that things happen that God was not aware of in advance. Okay. That God is surprised and even disappointed by what takes place. Howard Roy Elseth, in his book, Did God Know? A Study of the Nature of God, one of his appendices lists over 11,000 verses that reveal that God changes his mind. That's a lot. Another identifies a number of prophecies that were made to Israel that were not fulfilled. And then a couple of sections that identify what he calls explicit verses which show God did not know man's future choices, along with various occasions on which God changed his mind. Now, I hate to use the word inductive, but when you see these individuals who read the Bible without some kind of philosophical or theological lens determining what they emphasized and maybe what they set to one side, it looks like there are people who have found a great deal that doesn't fit in the traditional paradigm of God's relation to the world. And so there it goes. Now, I have to mention this out of deference to Dave in particular, but here we have precedents in philosophy as well as the ones in biblical study. Now, it's a totally different direction, we might say. Alfred North Whitehead is best known for his monumental work, Process and Reality, which gave rise to the whole concept of process philosophy and its successor, process theology. Another process philosopher that I must mention, since I wrote my dissertation on his thinking, is Charles Hartshorne. For years on the faculty at University of Chicago. Very much a supporter of Whitehead's view, although he claims that he came to his general conclusions not as a result of reading Whitehead, but quite independently. In later life, he moved down to Texas because his avocational interest was bird watching, And he was on the flight path of some of the migratory birds that flew from south of the border up to the northern part of North America. So anyway, as you can see here, the word process plays an important role in his thinking. Reality as social process. And then another book of his, The Divine Relativity. So the emphasis here is a sort of a turn away from the idea that God is, that ultimate reality is timeless, and that God is absolute and unchanging. No, a way of looking at reality is to see reality itself as involved in ongoing experiences, ongoing occasions of experience, to use one of Whitehead's expressions. And Hartshorne moved it more focus on the idea of God and sees God as divinely relative. So God is not only supremely independent from influences on, say, his existence and his character, but God is immensely connected with the world. Now, what's interesting about both these groups, the Bible students and the philosophers here, neither group represents, with one exception, neither group represents a sort of an established theological identity. So these precedents come from outside, but there are people who have looked at the Bible then with the insights that they have come up with and concluded that what they have to say about God deserves a great deal more attention than it's received. And that's sort of where open theism developed then. There were, this is the first book the beginning precedent to the stream of thought that came to the book that we're going to focus on today. The Openness of God was published in 1980, and The Future of Open Theism just came out this year, and so the distance between them is how many years? 40 years. A number that's filled with significance if you think of the Israelites in the wilderness, or the number of days Moses was on the mountain, Jesus' temptations. I mean, it's a portentous number, to say the least. Well, it began this way. In the summer of 1979, I was invited to participate in a conference on history and religion on the campus where I taught. And so I presented a paper on God's relation to the world, history and religion there. That was the topic of the conference. And somebody said, your ideas deserve a little further development. So in the weeks that followed in the summer, I expanded them a little, and then I had a manuscript. And I thought, well, maybe this deserves publication. I had to give it a title, so I came up with The Openness of God. I'm not sure quite where I got the title, but during my graduate study, not long before, I had read a book by a theologian, Eric Lionel Mascal, called The Openness of Being. And so I thought, well, I'll use a variation of that title. Let's call this The Openness of God. And that's where the first book entitled The Openness of God came. Richard Coffin heard that I'd been working on this project. He was an editor at Southern Publishing Association. He asked if I would send him the manuscript, and I did, and they accepted it for publication. There was a complication to that. He said, now Southern Pub is joining with, it's going to be joined now with the Review and Herald Publishing Association in Washington. And so when the book finally came out toward the end of 1980, it came out under the auspices or the imprint of the Review and Herald Publishing Association. So not that long into 1981, well, actually about halfway through the year, I got a letter from the administrative committee of the Review and Herald that said they had decided to withdraw the book from publication. It had generated a lot of criticism. People felt that it somehow was inconsistent and incompatible perhaps with the Adventist understanding of particularly prophecy and so forth. And so they decided to withdraw it. Well, then I was disappointed, as you can imagine. Not that long afterwards, I received another letter that said was being reinstated. Evidently, there were some very strong reactions to the decision to withdraw it from publication. And in response to those objections, they decided to go ahead. The story is, there's a backstory to that whole discussion a little later on. Maybe if there are further questions, we can address those if you're patient enough to hang around. But at any rate, that's what happened. Now, I thought that in fairly short time, the original printing ran out. There were people who heard about the controversy and bought up the book, and it was out of print. I got a letter from Clark Pinnock that out of the blue one day in April 1984, I recognized his name. He was a well-known evangelical theologian, a major contributor to Christianity Today. I had no idea why he'd be writing to me. And then his letter started, "This is a shot in the dark." And he went on to say, "I've read your book, The Openness of God. I liked it, and I wanted to establish contact." He also said he mentioned that he himself had gone from Calvinism to Arminianism, and we can talk a little more about that transition later. And so he liked the emphasis in the openness of God on human freedom and divine interaction between God and creation. And he also mentioned, however, that he had a heck of a time getting the book. He taught in Canada. Clark has passed away now. And he said he had to actually write to the Library of Congress in the United States to get access to the book. So he wondered what had happened. Was it withdrawn? Well, I wrote back and told him about that. And he said, well, you know, what you might do is send this book to Bethany House Publishers in Minneapolis. They appreciate Arminian literature. And at my suggestion, they have reprinted some other material that is sympathetic to the Arminian perspective, and see what they say about this. So I did. I sent The Openness of God off to them, and they looked at it. And time went by, as summer passed. I didn't know what would happen. And then I got a call from the managing editor, Carol Johnson. And I'll never forget the thing she said. It was a very short conversation. She said, "We've read your book. We believe its message, and we want to get it out to the people." Wow. And so, if you don't repeat this, Dave, I hope you don't share this. I suddenly understood why Paul went to the Gentiles. No, anyway, edit that out. This doesn't need to go there, but it was like, wow, here's somebody who's interested in this. And so it came out sometime later under this title. They said, you know, nobody knows what openness of God means. And they said, we want to sell books. And we want this book in bookstores to attract people's attention when it's on a display rack or something. So we're going to give it this title, God's Foreknowledge and Man's Free Will, because all kinds of people wonder about that issue. And so that's how it came out in 1985, God's Foreknowledge and Man's Free Will. New insights into the balance between divine foreknowledge and human freedom. And so that was in print for a while, and then it eventually went out of print. It's now available, by the way, if you're still interested, in Whiffenstock Publishers in Eugene, Oregon. Well, that was, you know, about it. And then a number of years later, I also got a call from Clark Pinnock, and he told me that he, along with 3 other scholars, were interested in writing a book about this general perspective, which was then known as free will theism. And he said, we've got, I'll tell you who the people are. Clark is on the right. He had an accident and bruised his face not long before this picture was taken. Just below him is John Sanders, and to his right above is William Hasker, and over on the corner beyond William Hasker is David Basinger. And Clark called and said, we're putting together a symposium volume. We've got the historical review of the discussions in theological history related to this book, this free will theism. John Sanders is writing that. I'm doing this is what Clark said. I'm doing a chapter on systematic theology. William Hasker is writing a chapter on the philosophical implications of free will theism. David Basinger is writing on the practical implications of this. We need someone to talk about the biblical background to free will theism, and that's why I'm calling you. Well, I said to Clark, you know, I'm not technically a biblical scholar. I really think, and I've appreciated very much the work of Terence Fretheim, a theologian who teaches at a Lutheran seminary, or I think he may be retired now, at Minneapolis. And I would suggest you contact him. And Clark said, here's another phone conversation you don't forget. He said, well, we already did. We asked him and he turned us down, and that's why we're asking you. So I said, well, okay, I'll be a part of that. Well, the five of us collaborated, and we sort of acted as editors for everybody else, and we circulated our manuscripts and came up and decided, okay, I think we're ready to submit it to publication. What would be a good title for this? And Clark suggested, you know, I've always liked the title of Rice's first book, The Openness of God. For one thing, it has a kind of positive ring to it. You know, openness is a good idea. And at the same time, it doesn't have any traditional theological baggage. It's just sort of, you know, we're coining an expression here. And so that's how the 1994 volume entitled The Openness of God came about. So there are two books that bear the title The Openness of God. And that's where we are. Now, not long after it came out, the 1994 publication stimulated a, let's call it a energetic discussion within the conservative theological community, we might say the evangelical theological community in the United States. It set off something of a firestorm in conservative theological circles. Sorry here, I'm got stuff spread all over the dining room table. And so we're going to look at this. Oh, I should mention that the openness of God received several other expressions, one by Clark Pinnock entitled The Most Moved Mover, I think, a nice send-up of Aristotle's unmoved mover. God is more moved than anything else by what happens, as opposed to completely unmoved by anything else that happens. John Sanders, provocative title it turned out, The God Who Risks, A Theology of Divine Providence. And then Gregory Boyd also wrote a book entitled God of the Possible. And that is another expression of this general position. A very recent book by William Curtis Holson just came out just last year with, I think, a very engaging title here, The God Who Trusts. I can understand why describing God as one who takes risks might raise hackles, but the idea of a God who trusts seems to carry very interesting positive connotations. You know, I'm not sure we would think that parents who take risks with their kids are doing the right thing, but parents who trust their kids, who cultivate a relationship of trust, and who invite their kids to be trustworthy, that carries a lot of positives. So here is a very recent discussion of open theism that he subtitles, A Relational Theology of Divine Faith, Hope, and Love. It's a wonderful book, and I highly recommend it. Well, Critics and Conflicts. Clark says in 2001, I did not for a moment imagine in 1994 that our book would create such interest and provoke such controversy, particularly in the evangelical theological community. And there were times when the intensity of people's reaction morphed into open hostility. Gordon Olson, not himself an open theist, 15 years after the book's publication, the 1994 publication, said, the controversy that surrounded open theism was the most dismaying and disillusioning thing I have experienced in my 50-some years of being an evangelical. It was really remarkable. Both, and you can see you can get the gist, the flavor of the criticism here. Beyond the bounds, open theism and the undermining of biblical Christianity. God Under Fire, another symposium volume. Modern Scholarship Reinvents God. And then we've got additional titles here. Grounds for Dismay. The Error and Injury of Open Theism. And it goes on like this. So one book title and one essay title after another. Some said they found it biblically uninformed, theologically misleading, a threat to the personal lives of those who find it attractive. And for them, open theism not only lies beyond the pale of acceptable theological options, but its advocates should be formally excluded from teaching Christian theology, and we should roundly criticize the circumstances that permit them to do so. Well, one of the most outspoken critics is John Piper, who says he sees open theism as theologically ruinous, dishonoring to God, belittling to Christ, and pastorally hurtful. My prayer is that Christian leaders will come to see it this way and count open theism beyond the bounds of Orthodox Christian teaching. Well, you get the picture here. Another critic is Bruce Ware, who maintains, you can see the title here, Their God is Too Small. Open theism denies what the Bible teaches and what all historical views affirm, and Christian leaders should declare it unacceptable as a viable, legitimate model within evangelicalism. Well, there you have it. Okay. What do we do with this? Fortunately, I think, the conversation shifted from confrontation and criticism to conversation. And that happened a little later. But in the meantime, in the early 2000s, Clark Pinnock and John Sanders were under particular scrutiny, along with Greg Boyd. But Clark and John were under particular scrutiny by the Evangelical Theological Society. And the question of whether or not they should really continue as members of that society, given its commitment to the inspired writings of the Bible and biblical inerrancy. And so there was a lot of attention given to this book and their views. In the fall of 2001, the Evangelical Theological Society annual meeting, 30 papers delivered on the topic, only 3 or 4 were favorable. The next year, in 2002, Pinnock and Sanders were, there was a business session held to decide if their views were compatible with the doctrinal basis of the society. And there are about 800 people met to consider a motion to refer the issue to the executive committee. And the committee took into account both the accusations and the defense and report their conclusions a year later. So in 2003, a vote was actually taken during another business session. Each scholar read a prepared statement. There was an hour's discussion and a vote by secret ballot on whether to sustain the charges against them. Pinnock's case, the vote was over 200 in favor, but over 400 against sustaining the charges. And so he was clearly accepted as a member of the society. The vote was different in Sanders' case. Well over 300 in favor of sustaining the charges and about 230 in favor against that. Since a 2/3 majority was required for dismissal, Sanders was able to keep his membership. He survived the 2/3 requirement. At any rate, that just gives you an idea of the time and the kind of criticism. Sanders survived the challenges to his ETS membership, but not the difficulties at the campus where he taught. He was discontinued in spite of glowing reviews of his teaching from students and school administration, and removed from a tenure track. And he, for years now, has taught at Hendrix College in Conway, Arkansas, where he's now a tenured professor. So you kind of get the idea here of how difficult things were for proponents of open theism at a while. Now, Stephen Roy and Millard Erickson both differed from the position of open theism, but they were far less harsh in their criticisms of it. And John Cooper wrote a book, Panentheism, the Other God of the Philosophers, and he came to the conclusion that open theism might be described as revised classical theism or voluntary relational panentheism, is a legitimate expression of ecumenical Christianity, even though it's not representative of Reformed theology. So that was a kind of, what should we say, a modification. The tone of the criticisms, at least among a number of people, subsided to a significant degree. And there were people, interestingly enough, who said, you know, in spite of the objectionable features of open theism, what open theists have done is make us aware of the numerous passages in the Bible which describe God as relating to events in this world, particularly responding to human beings and their different experiences in a very dramatic way. And so that deserves to be paid attention to. We don't accept their conclusions, but they have directed us to an aspect of the biblical portrayal of God that deserves more attention than our traditional approaches have given to it. So that was sort of granted as a concession that open theists, while they're wrong, have nevertheless emphasized some things that deserve to be given more attention. Well, open theism continued to develop, and in 2007, there was a meeting in Eastern Nazarene College for 3 weeks on open theism and science, sponsored by the John Templeton Foundation. And so I was a participant in that. We had a very interesting time listening to specialists in certain scientific areas and others who brought a lot of philosophical reflections to this. And 2 books, there was a follow-up meeting a year later, the next year at Azusa Pacific University. And out of this came 2 symposium volumes, Creation Made Free, Open Theology, Engaging Science, and then God in an Open Universe, Science, Metaphysics, and Open Theism. So this is an attempt to sort of interact between, or show the implications of open theism for a scientific view of things. We could go on. Open theism, as it developed, generated a lot of what we might call varieties within itself, different ways of looking at God's relation to the world. Open theists don't always agree on whether or not creation was necessary or optional for God. In other words, they see God as creating because God wants to. The question here is not, does God need the world for God's existence? That would be too much of a concession to process philosophy. Those of you who are acquainted with that, God needs the world as much as the world needs God. But for open theism, God is not dependent on the world for God's existence, but God's character, being fundamentally characterized by love and commitment to the others and so on, needs creation for God's character to find its full expression. So that's the issue there. Others maintain that God might or might not have created. The world was an option for God, not something that was inevitable given the kind of person that God is. Another question then was, has God always had a world? Even for those who maintain that creation was not necessary, but optional for God, or even if it's necessary, God has always had a world, even if it was something that God chose to do. Is there a sense in which God has always had a world with which he interacts and for which he cares? And there are those who maintain that yes, it's inconceivable that God would not have had a creaturely realm with which he interacts. And open theists like Tom Ord maintain that God has always had a world with which he's been in intimate relationship. Other questions have to do with whether or not God directly controls events that take place in the world. Open theists typically affirm that God has the power to do that, but does God ever exercise that power? Are things that happen in the world directly attributable to God's, shall we say, immediate hands-on control? Or does God always work through and in creaturely intermediaries to achieve God's objectives? Or can we turn to something and say, well, that clearly had to be a divine or even a supernatural occurrence because there's no natural explanation for it. It couldn't have happened any other way. And so there are some differences of opinion there as to the nature of God's involvement, whether it's always in and through intermediaries, the creaturely world, or does God directly involve himself in the world in ways that some might call intervention. And then another question that comes up is, what about divine temporality? If open theism emphasizes that God's relation to the world is an ongoing relationship, that there is past and future, not only for the world, but from God's own experience of the world, does God's temporality have a beginning? Does it coincide with creation so that it's from the moment of creation that God interacts with the world and God's own experience has temporal succession? And I suppose the other question would be, does it ever come to an end? And so here we are. Those are some of the questions that open theists deal with, and those are some of the questions to which they give varying answers. Now, let's, how am I doing for time? Probably way over. I haven't been looking.
No, you're fine.
So let me get it out here. Oh dear, I'm sorry. I've
No,
exhausted.
we've got an hour, Rick.
You keep talking. Okay, well, what I do in the second half of the book, I've kind of given you an extensive account of the background of open theism. What I try to do in the second half of the book, where the antecedents are, is talk about some of the ways in which the open perspective on God has an effect on the major Christian doctrines: God, humanity, salvation, church, and last things. To sort of introduce that, I argue against the idea that God is somehow limited in the open perspective of God. That's a word, that's an expression that is typically applied to open theism by its opponents and even by its supporters. The idea here is that God limits his power in order to provide for human freedom, or God's knowledge of the future is limited because there are things about the future God doesn't know. And as soon as you apply the word limit to God, I think that raises red flags for a lot of people. Oh dear, the God of open theism is limited, and the traditional view of God is unlimited. Well, given those options, you can imagine where people want to go. The notion that God's knowledge and power are unlimited is preferable to the idea that they're limited. I suggest we just set aside the idea of limits and maintain, for example, that instead of limiting God's power, open theism promotes the idea of a world that contains genuinely free beings, and that uniquely expresses God's power. So to empower others is an expression of power that in many ways is superior to just manipulating them, telling them what to do. Those of us in education have, for a number of years, have experienced a transition between the idea that the teacher is the source of knowledge, the one who does the study, gives the students the result of extensive investigation, well organized, and the student's job is to simply assimilate what the teacher has gone about learning and presenting. Instead, as one person put it, the teacher is no longer the sage on the stage, the teacher is the guide by the side, and the objective in education now is to enable students to become their own learners, to do their own investigation, arrive at their own conclusions. Now, having gone through this transition, I think the latter challenge is more formidable than the former one. Okay, how do you encourage and enable others to be learners, investigators, and draw their own conclusions? That is a greater challenge. And another way here is to see God's ongoing experience of the creature's decisions and actions as enriching the divine life in unique and irreplaceable ways. And so instead of God having it all at once, God interacts and God enjoys what's going on in the world. He's delighted by what takes place, disappointed when things don't go that way. I don't think that limits God. If anything, it enhances the understanding of God's experience of the world that God has made. And so I think that enriches our view of God. Now, I've just covered the first half of the book, more or less, and I need another hour. Well, I'm not going to take it. I just want to give you a hint of what goes in the rest of the book. And the doctrine of the Trinity, that's the focus of my essay on the doctrine of God. And I think there's some very interesting developments that have taken place in the history of the Trinity. I've been very influenced by the work of Robert Jensen, but he points out, you see El Greco's portrayal of the Trinity that I think is just so evocative on the left. But above you have a picture of St. Augustine, or St. Augustine, and below him is a picture of the Cappadocian theologians, Gregory of Nyssa, Gregory of Nazianzus, and Basil the Great. Now, the three of them responded to Arianism in a way that affirmed the Trinity, and according to Jensen, placed within the Trinity ongoing experience. When their ideas, they were Greek fathers, when their ideas came to the West, he maintains, they weren't well understood. Brilliant though he was, I don't think Augustine knew Greek as well as Latin. And as Jensen describes it, Augustine really didn't get where they were going. And so Augustine very much endorsed a view of God that emphasized God as changeless, essentially unrelated to what's going on in the world, and are unaffected by what's going on in the world. And there we are. So when it came left, how to put this, okay. The Cappadocians wanted to show that God is inherently related to temporal creation. Augustine wanted to show what God is in himself apart from creation. For the Cappadocians, God is complex. It's their togetherness of the three that constitutes God. For Augustine, God is simple. The Nicenes called God the Trinity because of the triune relationship and the differences. Augustine calls God Trinity in spite of them. So with these moves, Augustine severed the Trinity from its anchor in salvation history and cast it adrift on philosophical speculation. So I appreciate Jensen's emphasis on the relations of Father, Son, and Spirit. And he maintains, interestingly enough, these are temporal relations. Now I'll let you read Jensen to sort of expand that, or even my chapter on it, to see what I do with that. But in a way, it echoes one of the most famous statements about the Trinity in the 20th century thought. And that is that by Karl Rahner. This is Rahner's rule, as it's sometimes put. He says, the economic Trinity is the immanent Trinity, and the immanent Trinity is the economic Trinity. Now, what he means by that is, what we see about God in the history of salvation, the revelation of God as Father, Son, and Spirit, corresponds to the way that God is in God's self and always has been. That's where immanent and economic come from. Just a footnote, economic started as a theological expression, not a financial expression. So, economy of salvation, all right. So there was an explosion really of interest in the Trinity toward the latter decades of the 20th century, and it continues. There's a great deal written about it, but Rahner's rule is often cited as sort of the insight here that needs to be looked at. So I won't say more about the Trinity on this occasion, but what do we do with the notion of eternal life? Well, according to open theism, reality involves temporal succession, and God's experience of the world God has made involves a succession of temporal experiences. What do we do with the life to come? Is the life to come eternal life, everlasting life? Which do you pick? Is it timeless or is it ongoing? Well, it's interesting. For Rudolf Bultmann, we don't need to worry about the future because the meaning of human existence can be fully realized in each moment of decision. So Bultmann was an existentialist, okay? It's the here and now that counts. This is why the preaching of the word is so important, because if you respond to the word with faith and open your life to God, that is the realization of the meaning of history. We don't have access to the overall scope. Charles Hartshorne took the position that we are remembered by God. Our lives make a permanent contribution to God's mind, but we don't need to live forever because it would become everlastingly boredom. Sooner or later, we would have done everything worth doing. And it's just so tiresome. You just wish, how long is this going to last? I know Disneyland is closed, but if you've ever been there, you've probably run across people who just can say, I don't know how long this day is going to take to get through. I'm simply bored out of my mind. And I don't know, maybe some of us under quarantine for weeks now are ready to say, I got to break out of this. If this is the way it's going to be for the foreseeable future, things have got to change. At any rate, we're getting a brief instance. So Hartshorne says, no, we wouldn't want to live forever. And interestingly enough, both Jensen and Pannenberg, who affirm temporality, and Pannenberg says the end of history, Pannenberg is on the lower right, the end of history is essential to our understanding of the meaning of history. All the questions of history's meaning will be answered clearly by the end of history. History and eschatology. He affirms a literal resurrection of the dead. He maintains God's plans and God's character are not fully revealed until the end of history. So there's a definite emphasis on the value of the end of history. It makes everything clear. And gives a perspective on the whole historical process that finally reveals what God has been doing. Now, what's interesting, though both Jensen and Pannenberg emphasize the importance of the future and the value of God's connection with the ongoing course of events, both of them take the position that the future will consist of one timeless experience, that God's eternal perception of what's gone on throughout history will be a timeless moment of perception. And we will, in the future life, according to Pannenberg, we will in one timeless moment experience and see the value of our entire lives in one perception. My suggestion is this, that the future life consists of an ongoing series of experiences in which we continue to enjoy a relationship with God that goes on and on. I think it will involve a renewed and transformed relationship between God and human beings. God so loves and values the ones created in his image and rescued from sin that he invites them to enter his kingdom forever. Relieved of the inhibiting and debilitating effects of sin, the redeemed will experience uninterrupted fellowship with God. Their insights into God's wisdom will deepen. Their appreciation for God's character will grow. Their sense of God's majesty will expand. Their joy in God's presence will increase. And as a result, they will reflect God's glory more and more fully, and their role as God's representatives in creation will continue. So instead of one timeless moment, there is an ongoing series of experiences in which the interaction between God and creatures goes on and on, achieving new levels of excitement and fulfillment and satisfaction. One of the things that I've always been impressed with is the last parable one of the parables that Jesus told in his final sermon, and that is the apocalyptic discourse. The blessing announced to the faithful servants in the parable of the talents has two elements to it. Well done, good and faithful servant. You've been faithful over a few things, I will set you over many. Enter into the joy of your master. Well, I think those two elements in the blessing, ongoing responsibilities, ongoing activities. It's not over. Your service is still, in fact, it's just beginning, and it will be transformed in exciting ways. And the other is the joy of fellowship with God will be richer than ever. So I see those two elements in the blessing that God provides as a way of describing what the future life consists of. Well, when all is said and done, no view of God will ever be adequate. It will always fall short. I like some of the positive things that have been said about open theism. It's been around for several decades now. According to one student of it, Larry Witham, the openness of God reconfigured the landscape of theism. And he has a book called The God Biographers that you may want to look at, where he sort of traces this and has interviews with a number of open theists. So it had a dramatic effect. Another essay that I read online talking about open theism said this relatively young theology has hard work yet to do. There have been some promising beginnings, but there's a lot of work left. And then to sort of bring this all to a conclusion, I've never forgotten the concluding sentences in a book by Heinz Zart, a German theologian. The book is entitled Protestant Thought in the 20th Century. And at the end, he says, in the final analysis, even though we must always dare once again to do the unheard of thing, daring to speak of God in human words, God must forgive us our theology perhaps most of all. So we'll never get the picture perfectly filled out or filled in. But nevertheless, this is something which I think all serious Christians should attempt and commit themselves to, and that is to develop more and more moving, accurate, fulfilling pictures of God. So thank you for bearing with me as I've tried to look at one way of approaching these issues.
Thank you, Rick. Thank you very, very much for the book, for your ministry, and for the 45 minutes we now have. George has the first question. George Tyke.
What about now?
Okay.
Can you hear?
Yes. Thank you.
Yes. Oh, thank you. George Tishy here. I need to put a word of appreciation for this presentation to Rick Rice and thank him, thank you actually, for your first book. In the early 80s, I was still living in Brazil, and that's when the Desmond IV crisis exploded. And I was in the middle of that turmoil reviewing my theology when then I got that book in the early 80s. Now I learned that I was really lucky to get that one volume of The Openness of God. So Rick, thank you so much for that book. And that changed my life. For 40 years, I have been thinking different about God, and I appreciate what you have done for our thinking. Thank you.
Me too.
Thank you.
Okay, it's George Tishay. Is that right? Who has their hand up? I see someone with a hand up, but I don't know who it is.
I think it's Bernie Taylor.
Okay, Bernard Taylor.
Rick, thank you very much for this. To give a quicker context for my remarks, you presented to the School of Religion here in Loma Linda faculty on Tuesday. I had to leave that early, but I have had the opportunity to continue to think about this, and I've really come to appreciate it and have realized something quite unexpected. As you know, my training was at Hebrew Union College, the home of Reformed Judaism. And as in my studies, I have become increasingly aware, though lacking the vocabulary to describe it, that the Israelite religion, that is what the religion of the Old Testament, we have clearly the openness of God. There are so many instances. You mentioned somebody had found 11,000 instances of it. And then my mind went on from there, because between the Old Testament and the New Testament, Judaism arose, not as the direct successor of the Old Testament, but as a new religion, which was very quick to close the picture of God. And they put distance between God. You use the analogy of quarantine. They quarantined God to heaven, and they were embarrassed by the anthropomorphism, putting God in human terms in the Israelite religion, and anthropopathism, attributing to him human emotions. And I don't know whether this was directly because of their contact with the Greek world. I suspect that I do know that in Rabbinic Hebrew, there are many, many Greek words that Judaism came in contact with Greek philosophy, and it felt the impact. So by the time of the New Testament, the world was quite different. And we are accustomed to read the original Israelite religion in the light first of Judaism and then of Greek philosophy. And we have wondered why the picture of God that we grew up with is so harsh. And when we learn to read what the Old Testament is actually saying, and the openness of God when Abraham lectures him on how to be God, and so many of those instances, then the original was the openness of God.
Thank you, Bernie. I'm delighted to hear that from a scholar of your sophistication. That seems to reflect a more natural reading, shall we say, of many of the passages in the Old Testament that speak of God being sorry, for example, that he created. Jeremiah 18, where God says, if you do this, I'll do that. And if you do the other, then I'll have to do this. And then expressions of the prophets where God says, how can I give you up, O Ephraim? You know, I love you like a mother loves her little children. I've been down to take care of you. And here it's like, you know, the agony and the anguish that's portrayed there. I think you're right that, at least my sense is, it takes a lot of historical sophistication to get to this. The idea that God was impervious to anything outside, that to uphold the majesty of God, we have to attribute immutability, changelessness, absolute existence to God, is created a tremendous gulf between God and the creaturely world. And early Christians, like Arius, put God in, shall we say, put Christ in the middle of that gulf. So Christ is the one who mediates between God and the creaturely world. God is beyond all this, so there's a kind of an emissary that mediates. And so Christ is not, to quote here, Christ is not fully God, but God for us. And it was really in reaction to that the Council of Nicaea and follow-up Council of Chalcedon in the 4th and 5th centuries maintained, no, to be faithful to Christian revelation and Christian insight from the very beginning, Christ must be included as God. And without that connection and that identification of Christ with God, even people who aren't that thrilled with the Trinity have said, you know, had Arianism won the day, it would have been all over with Christianity. Christianity would have been just another of these many sort of mystery religions which placed all sorts of intermediary beings between ultimate reality and where we are. And the purpose of human life is to sort of move through these stages. No, for fundamental Christian confidence, God has been revealed in Christ as God truly is. And so I love the statement by Karl Barth. I can't quote it here with complete precision, but he says, for God, it's just as natural to be lowly as it is to be high, to be away as it is to be at home, and so forth. So that's what we see, the portrayal of God in the plan of salvation. And so that comes with a reaction against the idea that God is absolutely impervious to any sort of being affected by the temporal world. So thank you for assuring me that I haven't misunderstood the emphasis of, or the portrayal of God that we have in the Hebrew scriptures themselves. I think that's very insightful.
Thank you very much. Our next questioner is named 41,719.
Yeah, that's Dick Osborne, and I haven't been able to rename it on this one. Most of my Zooms, I can rename it. So, Rick, you talked a lot about the reception in the broader evangelical world, but I didn't hear you talk much about Adventism's response to your work. You've been able to teach in 2 universities with very progressive and open religion theology departments. You've had progressive presidents who have not put pressure on you. Have they been under any pressure, like from the Adventist Accrediting Association or from church leaders in regard to views? How have you been able to exist with these views in the broader world? Second question is, Desmond Ford gave a speech at PUC that set off a torrent of protest in lots of meetings. It seems that maybe your ideas might be as threatening, perhaps, to some traditional Adventist theological views. How have you been able to exist in this kind of environment over the last 40 years?
Well, that's a personal question. So, I'm not sure that any of us who proposed open theism were arguing for major denominational changes organizationally, but rather recommended this as a perspective that deserves serious consideration. And so I have felt that this is a valuable way of looking at it. If we look at Ellen White's writings, we find a range of discussions as an Adventist. She's very, she makes statements to the effect that God took a risk to the degree that heaven itself was imperiled in sending God's Son to this world. So the idea of God taking risks is not something that is without any sort of Adventist precedent. So I've been, in a sense, trying to emphasize the sense of drama and even controversy that is very familiar to Adventism. I don't know the extent to which there's been some kind of criticism in the back. I think being on the West Coast and maybe being part of a large university which has, as we know now all too vividly, challenges of its own in other areas may mean that I have been somehow shielded from criticism. But I know there are those who are very strongly resist open theism. They're critical of it. I have not tried to make this an issue that I think demands the church's widespread attention and decision. Okay, I've not tried to make it a revision, but I know that there's very strong resistance to it among many people. And a lot of people see, I just don't see how you can relate this to prophecy, which seems clearly to indicate that God has a very extensive, indeed exhaustive knowledge of everything that's going to happen. So I can't answer that completely. Sort of on other levels, I know it has been a kind of a threat. If you're interested, I don't know how widespread this will be, but I had written the longest book I've ever written is The Reign of God, which was an introduction to Adventist theology. And I wrote it as an attempt to meet some of my personal needs as a teacher of Adventist doctrines on an undergraduate level on the La Sierra campus of what was then Loma Linda University. And my first sabbatical quarter, I had a summer and a fall off, I said I want to come up with something that I can use in my classes. And so I worked hard and came up with a long manuscript and mimeographed copies of it. And then it wound up in the hands of the director of the Andrews University Press, who looked it over, sent it out, and lo and behold, it was accepted for publication by them. They had a lot of suggestions for study guides and modifications, and I spent a couple more years working on that. And then when it was about to come out, I heard it was about to come out, somebody said, well, I'm not sure that it's going to make it. And I wondered what had happened. And I heard that there was somebody on the press board that really felt my association with open theism put a cloud over this publication and didn't want it to come out under the auspices of Andrews University Press. And there was a new president at the time who looked it over, and others maintained the author has signed a contract. The author has made all the revisions we've asked for. I don't know how we can interrupt the process now. And so the president said, no, I think we have to go ahead. And so that's how that book continued. But I know there's been serious opposition to this in various places. So to be honest with you, I haven't made it a focus of my teaching very much because I realized in my classes that raising this issue would probably generate a lot of concern among some of our students. I don't have students here that I have quarter after quarter to try to sort of look at things over a long period of time. And I've been reluctant to bring it up with my classes. Now, if I'd had, let's say, in a different kind of situation, if I'd been teacher of a graduate at an institution with ongoing students that I would sort of mentor over a long period, I might have invited them to do research in this area, and that would have been a chance for us to work together. But frankly, I haven't emphasized this much, and I'm sorry to say that's been to the disappointment of some of my students. Not many that I know of, but I did have somebody who'd had a class from me, and I'd happened to run into him later. He mentioned, you know, I'm acquainted with your perspective on the doctrine of God, and I was really kind of disappointed that we didn't get into it in class here. So let's just say I haven't pushed that, either in my teaching or in my ministry generally, although a lot of people know I share this. It's not something I've tried to promote actively in a way that would generate the kind of attention that might be disruptive to the life of the church.
Thank you, Rick. May I interrupt just for a moment, please? Can you hear me, Rick?
I am. I'm listening. It's
Okay.
new. Straight up.
Thank you very much. Could you back out of your sharing so we can no longer see that picture, but see the people?
You want to see me?
Oh, all the others too. If you can just back out of sharing.
I don't know.
I think at the top of the, there at the very top, there's a place. There we go. Now we can see many more people all at once. Thank you very much. I think Robert Paulson was going to speak. Am I right?
Yes, I have a quick question for you, Rick. In a Sabbath school about 3,000 miles away, and earlier this morning, Chuck Sandifer asked a question of Jan Paulson to give a bit of a tour of his own personal journey to coming to his position on women's ordination. Can you tell us a little bit about where your journey was? Because I'm sure it didn't start with the scholarly research. It started someplace else, to how you came to the position of your understanding of God.
Well, that's a great question. I'm not sure I can give a step-by-step change, but I went back once to look at the doctrine of God, the outline that Fritz Guy had required of us when I was a sophomore in his class, Introduction to Theology at La Sierra College, way back in the 60s. Fritz had very high expectations of his undergraduate students then. And so in my outline of the doctrine of God, I wanted to see what I'd said about God's relation to the world. And lo and behold, it was very much in the traditional mode. God is changeless. God is not affected by what happens in the world, that sort of thing. So I would have to say it came about later on. Now, I think what happened is I did study with process thinkers in my my graduate school experience, and they awakened me to the possibility of thinking about God in relation to the world in a new way. And it may have been as a result of that. Also, during our time at Chicago, a number of us were studying at the university. There were others at the Divinity School, and there were others in the university as well. And we got together on weekends at a little church. A lot of us went to the St. John's Community Church there in outside Chicago. And we would go to church there. We were welcomed by the people and the pastor. And a lot of times we had lunch together in a park somewhere. And we would go through the issues that we learned in classes and raise some of the ideas. And so we worked through all that. And I think it was a process of trying to put together the ideas I was getting from my study of Whitehead and Hartshorne and in my theological classes generally, and where I'd come from, and looking back on my own life experience and realizing that there were things in my life that I don't think I could attribute to God's direct plan, detailed plan for my life. My parents had some great difficulties for a number of years, and my father and mother separated and then divorced and so on. And there was a lot of discomfort and pain there. And so I grew up as an Adventist with our Arminian background and our Methodist connection, so I always affirmed free will. And I always believed that God was very much a part of our lives. But it seemed to me this other way of looking at God's relation to the world made more sense out of more evidence biblically, made sense out of the passages that are often sort of placed to one side to make room for the traditional view of God's absoluteness and immutability and exhaustive foreknowledge. It made sense of that, and it also opened up human experience in a way to God's immediate connection. And so there was a lot of appeal to it. And they had ways of working out a relationship between the idea of God being absolute and changeless, and yet at the same time, sensitive, responsive, and concrete in God's experience of the world. So the notion of God as having two aspects to God's nature. One, as absolutely unchangeless as the traditional view wants in his existence and his character, and yet in God's experience, immensely sensitive and ongoing in his concrete experience of the world. That way of affirming two aspects to the divine reality seemed to me to make sense out of more evidence, not only philosophically, but theologically, and kind of give what would you say, an intellectual ballast or foundation to what many of us experience in a personal level, and that is that God is with us here and now in the day-to-day experiences of life. And certainly, just to make a practical application, with the uncertainty we're facing now and the challenges we're facing about deciding how to relate to this and what its long-range implications may be, that sense of God is with us here and now. God is sharing with us the immense personal challenges, the range of experiences we're going through, the bewilderment, the disappointment, the immense loss of so many people around us, and yet a desire for hope and confidence that God's purposes are not being thwarted. They will ultimately be fulfilled. I don't know, that this view of God as our ongoing companion and it is something of immense value to us here. So I guess that would be the reaction. It took a while. I wasn't taken in by some of the aspects of the what we would call the process thought and God in process reality. I felt that God does not need a world for God's experience and so forth. But nevertheless, to see that as a voluntary decision on God's part, and once having made that decision, God is, from the moment of creation on, deeply invested in the world. That has a way of making sense out of biblical evidence and personal experience that I found immensely helpful. So I didn't go through, it wasn't a matter of sort of giving up and coming back. It was kind of an evolutionary development. I don't know if that's helpful or not.
Yeah, thank you, Rick. I'm going to ask a question that's not too serious and then go over to Eduardo. And then McKinley, after Eduardo, I'm going to come to you. You don't have to say anything, but if you do, this is a time. Don't wait till the session's all over and then have your comments, okay? If God's experience is that of one timeless moment, can God experience music? I would think not, because music depends upon temporal transition. And so I would think that if God is experiencing one timeless moment, it would be a single hum throughout the whole universe. What do you think?
Oh, I think that's a powerful example of a way in which succession and a succession of experiences finds support in aesthetic experience. It's not timeless. It's not one, multi-tonic hypertonic, or whatever the word is, at once, one lasting chord, but it's ongoing, and you lose the sense if you have it there. The only sort of composition I can imagine would be, or the only experience that would illustrate the other would be a composer's sense of the whole composition at once, that knowing from beginning to end what each part should contain. But it seems to be, without the successive experience, it doesn't accomplish the composer's goals of creating an aesthetic experience that goes through various phases when it reaches a climax. So I think you're right. But I think there are ways of looking at it from the other side. I think of, I suppose, a producer of a play, or let's say a playwright, knows from beginning to end what's going to happen, whereas those of us who go to see the play, we enjoy it on an ongoing basis. So those would be different experiences, but I think that God has set the world up in such a way that we can enjoy it in a temporal way, and God enjoys our temporal enjoyment of it as things go by.
All right, thank you. I have Eduardo. Yoli, did you say you wanted to speak?
Yes.
Who spoke up? Was it, who spoke up saying I wanted to speak? I'm sorry?
Yoli did.
Okay, Yoli, let's go to Eduardo, then Yoli, and then we'll go from there. So Eduardo, you're next. Okay, over to Yoli.
Okay, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Very well.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Rice. In my limited view, I see God as the good energy, the love in the universe, admitting that there is another energy. I also believe that God did, as a God of love, was almost compelled to create people, because when you love, you want to share. My limited view. Also, regarding theism, I believe the overarching precepts underpinning that concept include, culture, educational vicissitude, our willingness to be honest, and other factors. And also the way we experience God, whether we experience him as coercive or influential. I think there's room for every and any kind of thought. Trying to kind of kill thought is an effort in futility. I enjoy listening to
are you
everything.
saying, I'm sorry, y'all, go ahead.
My fundamental belief, if I could use that word, is that there is a God of love, but people keep blaming him for their conduct. That's
okay,
all.
Rick, do you want to pick up on that? Eduardo, get ready to speak if you're there. Rick, please.
Thank you, Yoli, for your questions. You've touched on a number of major issues there. You started out by the idea that God is a force for love and goodness in the world, not the only power there is in the world, and I would agree with that. There are certainly other influences. My own view of the nature of evil, I do follow Augustine. I think the view of evil as a privation is a good one. Evil is the taking away of something good. It's not a force that exists alongside the good with equal significance and equal status and so forth. So that was one thing you touched on. Where we go from there, I think the power of God in the world and how we experience God. I think God is always consistently at work to promote loving purposes and caring, and that in spite of the challenges to that we can have confidence that this is what God is doing. Now, even if we can't see how that's playing out, and we wish that God were doing things that look to us like the obvious solution to problems, we can still be confident that God is doing the very best for the situation that God is faced with. Now, your last challenge had to do, or your last question had to do with, if you can just remind me of that.
I mentioned that often we blame God for the things that we do. And also, if I may add one more thing, the Lord's Prayer indicates that what we do affects what happens in heaven.
I think that's true. I think we do have an effect. And I think that ideally the Lord's Prayer expresses the, what should I say, the priorities that a person who is perfectly in tune with God will have. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done. So I'm more concerned with what God is doing in my life than what I want God to do from my perspective. So, but that's a challenge. I see a contrast in Jesus' own experience between the Lord's Prayer, which has things ideally laid out, and then Jesus' prayer in the Garden of Gethsemane, where he starts out with what he wants. Take this cup from me. And then follows by, nevertheless, not my will, but thine be done. I think the challenges we face in this world lead us to be immediately concerned and preoccupied with what we want God to do for us. And then the resolution of that would be our commitment to cooperating with God so that God's purposes can be fulfilled. That would be sort of the ideal, and that's where Jesus' own spiritual experience reached final resolution, where I will do thy will, confident that what you're doing will be for the best, and that my greatest contribution in life, the highest level I can achieve in life, is to be a part of the fulfillment of God's purposes, not will God do what I wish God would do for me in this present situation.
Okay, Rick, I have a question for you. You said that you favor privation understanding of evil. First of all, I don't know that Gregory Boyd, who is a open theist, would go along with that, would he? And does one really want to say that evil is nothing but the emptiness of good? Doesn't evil have a sort of vigorous and energy that we can see in terrible, terrible things like the Holocaust and so forth? Is saying evil is emptiness, or nothing is evil to God, no thing is evil to God, is that going to be enough?
I think Augustine is talking about the ultimate nature of evil, and that evil is a privation of the good means that you can have, this is sort of Augustine's own experience. He goes from a Manichae, where you've got evil and good are two competing forces, each having equal status within the ultimate nature of things. He becomes a Platonist, a Platonist which says, no, the only reality is the ideas, it's good. Reality itself is good. Well, then how do you account for evil? Well, evil is something that's essentially good that's lost some of its goodness. There's been a falling away. And when we think of the fall, and we think of that, we realize that, I mean, in the Christian tradition, the highest force of evil, or the greatest force of evil, was a fallen angel. That original reality was good and now it's been perverted. That isn't to say that we don't encounter it as a positive, negative force, but it is to say, if you look at it carefully, it's not, it doesn't have a positive role in the scheme of things. So it's not equal standing ontologically there. It's a turning away. So it's sin is not turning towards something. It's a turning away from something. It's a turning away from God. It's not that you've got good and evil side by side. They're both equally sort of standing. It's like there's really one choice that God wanted us to make, and we could accept God, respond to God's love, but we could also turn away from it. So that's where it is. It's a turning aside. Now, yes, in the world in which we live, evil is a powerful force. But what's interesting is the more gifted just look at this, the more gifted a person is, the more dangerous that person can be if all of those gifts are turned to evil purposes. A genius who uses superior intelligence as a way of dismantling a whole system, maybe financial system or economical system or educational or whatever, can wreak more havoc on more lives than somebody who just does, makes your life miserable for an hour or something like that. I mean, I'd rather be pickpocketed than have somebody raid my bank account and take out all of the savings I've accumulated. The difference there, and I think that would be a difference. So I'm not saying that evil isn't, as we experience, a palpable, powerful force, but I just think that it's best understood as not having a place in God's world originally and not being there where it belongs. I read a little. I read a little. Yeah, I read a little Paul Ricoeur's phenomenology of the will when I was in graduate school. I didn't do very well writing a paper on it, but he starts out with a phenomenology of the will, the voluntary and the involuntary, and so on. And he maintains that we have freedom and we can exercise freedom in a variety of ways, a lot of different ways, but you don't get to the negative exercise of freedom just by analyzing freedom. You've got to look at the way people actually use it, and that can lead to. So he had to write a sort of a second series of reflections on the nature of the will, and he calls that the symbolism of evil. If you don't get to evil just by analyzing freedom, it becomes a kind of a fact that's there that has to be dealt with, but not a necessary corollary of freedom. And I would say evil is there, we can counter it, but it's not a necessary corollary of God's good creation. It's an intruder. To give an account of it is to excuse it. It doesn't belong here. It's a violation. It's a little like, what is disease? You know, well, disease is a disruption of a healthy life.
Okay.
Dave,
I think talking about Augustine's statement as an ontological one rather than an ethical one, I think that's very helpful. McKinley, did you want to say anything?
Yeah, since you called upon me, thank you. I have a couple of observations and then a question. So thank you, Dr. Rice, for the presentation. It covers quite a lot. I think, as I've observed last Sabbath, a lot of these exercises are attempts to understand who God is and how his character expresses in his interaction with his creation and creatures. So my quick observation is that God's foreknowledge doesn't limit man's free will. And I think the retitling of your book essentially addresses a challenge that many Christians try to navigate, God's foreknowledge versus man's free will. And I want to focus on that element of your presentation. I tend to come to an understanding of some of these topics from an engineering point of view. And with that in mind, I've also come to the perspective that God does have an exhaustive knowledge of the future. And I come to that understanding from this perspective. I don't know, are you familiar with an engine map?
No.
Okay. So we engineers tend to characterize the performance of an engine by looking at how it would operate over a range of conditions. And we can typically predict the behavior of that engine or a physical system by defining certain perspectives or certain conditions along that entire operating range. Using that example, I generated something called a life map. And when you think about life from the perspective of God's position, he's got massive amounts of information over the period of eternity, or however long you want to define an interval of God's knowledge. And as a result, he can, along that life map, describe a ton of different pathways along which humans can experience life. Along those pathways, humans are able to exercise their free will, their freedom of choice, and experience different outcomes. At the same time, because of God's vast knowledge and information base, if you like to use the analogy of big data, he can look at any path along that map and see into the future where that person's life is going to end up based on choices they're making along those paths. That person can also choose to move from one pathway to another pathway to another pathway, and God can see in, again, that model, how that person's life might turn out. But again,
okay, let's get, I think we've got the picture.
Okay.
You've
So
got
the
these
question
different
is,
pathways, and then God can determine, God knows which pathway you're going to take, okay? And then
right,
Elmer, I think you're next.
I was just going to ask
Well,
him.
but let's have Rick respond to that first.
Yes. Does he have a view about that?
Thank you. That, I think you would find among a number of open theists some perspectives that would resonate with your, shall we call it, your life map. Gregory Boyd is one who takes that position, and others do too. That God, here's what I would say. For me, the negative view of exhaustive foreknowledge is that it removes from God's potential experience the wonder of momentary surprise, satisfaction, enjoyment from personal interaction. So if God knows everything about the future, then God knows what's going to happen, and whatever reaction God has to it is already there. So the question is, and I think you pointed out one, how can there be some sort of confidence if, I think it's what the traditional view denies of God's experience that's significant too. God seems to be, it's all there, it's all planned, God's never surprised, God's never, I would rather want to emphasize that God's relation to the world is such that God is capable of delight and surprise and disappointment. However, where I think you're right is that God anticipates the future perfectly. I would rather, instead of perfect foreknowledge, I would rather put it in terms of perfect anticipation. And there I would say, God is never taken so out of, nothing happens that God is not prepared to meet. So God is not completely untracked by what happens. God may be disappointed by the choices that are made, but it's not that God has no response that's available to it. The analogy I've sometimes used is that of an ideal emergency room physician. Okay. In the emergency room, I understand, a physician has to be ready to deal with any number of situations that come up. It's not like a schedule that follows, people come in on a regular time and the physician maybe already prepared for a surgery that they may need or something like that. But here's somebody who comes in with a tragic experience. What does an ideal emergency room physician do? Meets that emergency out of the resources that person has at that time. So I would see that as a way in which God is prepared for these eventualities, but there is a difference in God's experience from the possibility that could occur and God's actual response and experience of these events as they happen. So
I agree.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you, McKinley. I'm glad we got you in a little earlier this time. Thank you very much. I think Elmer Capino's next.
Thank you very much for the presentation, Dr. Rich. Dr. Rice, as you're developing the
Elmer, could you come a little closer to your microphone, please?
can you hear me? Am I coming through better?
Yeah.
Better, yeah.
Okay, Dr. Rice, thanks very much for the presentation. As you're developing the principle, was thinking the development of the principles behind the openness of God seems to parallel the development of our cognitive functions. The task of a person from birth to death is to get rid of our egocentric thinking and to develop altruistic thinking. There's 40 years between your two books. Were there any modifications from your first book to the second book?
Wonderful question.
Well, I think the basic convictions about God's relation to the world are very strong and have been consistent. What I have been very impressed by is the number of very thoughtful treatments of open theism have been generated by philosophers dealing with a whole range of issues. What do we do with the nature of time? What is the nature, different ways of accounting for God's experience? So I haven't departed from the basic convictions here, but I've come to appreciate more and more the ways in which people have taken these thoughts into different directions.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Elmer, did you have more to say?
No, that's it. Thank you.
Okay. Eduardo, I'm going to try for you again. Are you there?
Yes.
Okay,
Rick,
go for it.
Rick, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Sister White wrote to her son, Edson White, and said, please send us your writings so we can criticize them hard, because the more criticism, the better. For the sake of harmony, to submit your writings of your idea, the openness of God, to hard criticism. So for the sake of harmony with the church.
Do you understand? Are you asking Eduardo that Rick should present his ideas to some representative group from the church to see what they think? Is that your point?
The rule of Sister White Times that the House of Publishing, they have a book committee where everybody submit their books. And the book committee decided if they were going to publish it or not.
Aha. Okay, Rick, it seems to me, I'm sorry, Eduardo. It seems to me that maybe Rick's book went through that process, but go ahead, Rick.
Well, I think that was one of the interesting exchanges that takes me way back. But one of the church officials who sort of talked to me to sort of explain why this had happened and so on, suggested that I think following the path that you are indicating, we should publish material that reflects the general consensus of the church and not publish material that would be in any sense disruptive to their experience. I guess my reaction, and it may have been a bit unrealistic, I was a lot younger then obviously, would be to say, I don't understand why publishing something can't be the first stage in the church's discussion, rather than, or the community's discussion, rather than a final account of it that's presented as something that now the church fully endorses and everybody agrees with. And he indicated, well, that's not quite the way it works. But I would say, can we share different views on issues in a way that would be mutually stimulating, maybe mutually inspiring and enhancing, without necessarily trying to say, this falls within or is outside the bounds of acceptable Adventism. That approach to things is one of the most painful. People are perfectly willing to disagree, but what was so painful was trying to draw a boundary around this viewpoint that led to the tremendous personal criticism and professional dismay of people who were hoping to get a conversation going. So I think there's a difference between I would like to think of a healthy religious community as one where different ideas can be shared and not necessarily a particular view of them demanded. A lot of people have said to me, interestingly enough, you know, I appreciated reading your book because these were always questions I had. These were things I thought about, I wondered about. I was never completely satisfied with the answers that I was sort of given. And I'm so refreshed that we're now able to talk about these things. And so I would like that spirit of conversation to characterize our consideration of certain issues. Now, I agree with you that there comes a time when certain positions must be seriously addressed because they're not reflective of where the church has been and a healthy community participation within the church. But I don't know that this was ever one of those issues. I wasn't trying to make it that kind of issue. I was offering it as something that might be helpful to people. And that's what I hoped it would do. It was others who said, no, this is the kind of thing that needs to be some sort of authorized. But I don't think it ever assumed that proportion within the church, like some of the other issues we could raise up. I was not trying to set up the Seventh-day Organization of Open Theists or something like that. I just found this to be very helpful, and I found it to be very reflective of some prominent themes in Adventism. I like to think of this as a consistent Arminianism. You know, if